final adult formation of the year, which has gone by very fast. Thank you to Father Dean last week for his talk on how to love the Bible and read it well. I had a great time in Connecticut. I was just telling Father Dean I'd gone down to do a teaching thing, and we hope to get, I don't know, like 15 people signed up for this New Testament class. That was like our big goal. We got 56. And so it went very, very well. The pastor was preaching on that text in John, where the disciples get more fish in the net than they can pull in. And I thought it was oddly kind of like relate to this text. Anyways, so it was great. We had Gordon's graduation yesterday, which was really, really fun. Perfect weather for that. Another great graduating class. We had 25 of our majors graduate. So it was fun to see their, great work rewarded. This afternoon I get to lead a graduate intensive for 3 days before our trip takes off to Greece on Thursday. So it's nice and busy, which was perfect when Lisa's car decided to stop working on Tuesday. Perfect. That's right on time. Just one more thing. But anyways, I'm really looking forward to this kind of final portion of Acts. We're going to be looking at a little bit of Acts 17, although Allie did a great job last Sunday kind of setting that one up. So I don't think we'll spend as much time there because I don't want to repeat all the stuff that you heard from her. But we'll get on to Corinth and a few other places, Ephesus, where Paul goes, and then see how the book of Acts wraps up. As I mentioned, our trip takes off on Thursday, and we're going to be in Athens on like the 25th or 26th. So, and some of the pictures from the slides are from my last trip there 2 years ago. So we're really looking forward to that. We appreciate your prayer as we go, just for simply traveling mercies at minimum, so our connections are made and there's no traffic on the way to and from, and that we obviously have a great time of learning and connection and seeing God's work in the world. So really looking forward to that. To dive on in, you heard last Sunday the lectionary was Acts 17, which was great timing. Can't plan that out. And Acts 17 is this really interesting passage. It's had what we sometimes call a second life of its own outside of the Bible. If you run around in Christian circles, this has usually been a text for a lot of missiology, so the study of missions or global kind of Christianity, primarily on like how to win friends and influence people, right? Because it seems at first glance that Paul is really endearing himself to the Athenians. So this text has lived a kind of alternative life in terms of evangelism, mission, discipleship. How do we relate, quote, quote, to culture is sometimes usually the frame that I see this text under, which I think is interesting. I mean, I think all the Bible is rooted in a world where it's trying to make sense of this very Jewish story in a Greco-Roman world. And so Acts is certainly interested in how this message gets translated, to use that word, from one culture to the next, right? We looked at the beginning of formation with this entirely Jewish movement that then breaks out into the Gentile world. There is a big jump there that has to happen, and Paul is certainly at the center of it. And I like to sometimes call Paul a cross-cultural translator, right? So he is making this Jewish story of Israel's God from Genesis to Malachi make sense, or to, as I sometimes say, put it in the key that Gentiles can hear. He seems to be particularly adept at that, particularly gifted at that translation piece. And so we do see that all over. I do think Acts 17 is doing something a little bit differently. Paul does quote most famously some Greek poets, Aratus and another guy, I forget his name. And he does kind of situate that within this kind of broader piece of Acts 17. But there's some other interesting features that a scholar named Kevin Rowe, who's a favorite of mine, he teaches down at Duke. You know Kevin? Yeah, Kevin's a great guy. And he has a really interesting take on Acts 17, that Paul is actually not trying to win friends and influence people, but rather the situation might be a bit more dire. And we see that, we'll see that a little bit with how I think Luke sets up this story. I think it's interesting to note that when we get to Acts 17, in some ways, Paul never meant to go to Athens. If you read the text very carefully in Thessalonica, he's actually like on the run for his life. And so the temperature's getting too hot in Thessalonica with some of his Jewish contemporaries. And so his friends say, Paul, time to get out of Dodge, because if you stay, we're really worried you're not going to make it. And so he kind of runs down to Athens, which we'll be making that journey ourselves in a couple days by an air-conditioned cool bus. Hopefully not under threat for our lives, but you never know, right? So we'll be doing that in a much less stressful way than probably Paul. But he gets down to Athens, and so he's kind of waiting, right, for his friends to come down from Thessalonica and keep him going down to Corinth, which is where he's going to go next. And Paul, which I like to imagine is like me, gets a layover in Athens and decides to get out of the airport and go see the sights. And that kind of sets up our story in Acts, where Paul is deciding to look around because, he's here. He might as well see something. He's heard a lot of great things about Athens. And decides to kind of walk around a little bit. And what he sees, as Luke tells us in this story, he gets very, very distressed. In Acts 17. Oh, good, it's there. Okay. Here, let me find the text. So notice verse 16, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, right? So he's biding his time. This key word here, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So this term, deeply distressed, Roe mentions is kind of our first clue to how Paul feels about the situation. This deeply distressed language is used throughout the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, to talk about God's reaction to idols, which, as you can imagine, not great, right? So he's deeply kind of enraged a little bit as to what he sees. And so he's arguing with anyone he happens to meet. He meets Epicurean and Stoic philosophers in the marketplace, in the Agora. And these are two of the leading philosophies of the day. We talked a little bit, at some point, memory fails me, about how Paul is often thought of in the ancient world as a philosophical teacher, more than like a religious figure, because he's talking about a way of life. He's gathering disciples. He's talking about moral matters of good, evil, right, wrong, fill in the blank, right? In the ancient world, that's not the domain of priests as much as it is today. It's the domain of moral philosophers. People like Seneca, Aristotle, Stoic philosophers are the ones thinking about what makes for a good life, how should you live, right? That's a philosophical concern in the ancient world, not necessarily a religious concern. And so this scene makes a lot of sense in the ancient world. He's approached by philosophers who say, oh, looks like you got something to trade. Let's talk about what you're offering, right? And so they kind of get in a debate here. And what we get here is he meets these philosophers, and they call him a babbler, which is a slam. It's this idea of, if memory serves me right, of kind of a bird picking up seed and then kind of the seeds dropping out of the mouth. Like you've got little snippets, right, of philosophy. Or as I like to say, it's like a freshman philosophy major, right? Have you ever met them? They're the most confident people you'll ever meet, right? It's like what is reality? Just like, what is it? Right? And so this is kind of that feel, right? They think you're kind of hacking it here. You're kind of an amateur hour. And so we want to kind of hear you out. And the interesting thing is I think he's a proclaimer of foreign divinities. Now notice that's in the plural. We think you're the proclaimer of foreign gods. Gods, plural. And Luke explains it to us, because we might miss that from a modern sense. Because we talk about Jesus and his resurrection all the time, right? Just did it at Easter. Well, in Greek, they hear two deities. Anastasis, resurrection, and Jesus, Iesus. And so they hear Jesus talking about kind of a male deity and its consort, right? The male and female kind of deity here. And so they think he's proclaiming these new gods that he's bringing into the city. And it's this line that Rose says is a little, our other clue, our other signal, that something is off in this scene. And Rowe makes this pretty big case. I can send around the journal article if you're bored or have trouble with insomnia. That's actually a really good article. I was getting to my students to say, they think I'm really weird. I was like, you should have a favorite journal article, and this is mine. Just for style, content, writing style. And they're like, you have a favorite journal article? I was like, who doesn't? Right? You don't? You're the weird one. Right? So this is my one that I always show them, but it really is I was going to say cracking article, as the British would say. It's really, really great. Anyways, he makes this case that this line, the proclaimer of foreign divinities, is actually a link to a very little bit older Greek story about this really pressing scene with a trial where Socrates is on trial for his life. And so if you go all the way back to the story about Socrates on trial, the charge that the Athenians, keyword here, make, is that Socrates is proclaiming foreign divinities. And there's this other little line that always cracks me up, that he's corrupting the youth, which I just find hilarious, right? Like, what about the kids? Right? And so Rowe mentions that it says Luke is setting up the scene that Paul is on trial, just like Socrates. And if you remember at the end of the trial of Socrates, it doesn't go well for him. He gets convicted and ends up drinking hemlock and kills himself. And so Rowe's point is that this whole scene is set up. Paul is deeply distressed. The Athenians are skeptical to the point of, do we need to put this guy on trial? And so what Rowe says is we kind of get like a pre-hearing in this case. It's like a pre-trial. Do we need to kind of kick this up a notch to the authorities? Because bringing in foreign divinities is actually a pretty big deal in the ancient world. You don't just talk about other gods in the Roman world. It's actually the emperor's job to bring in new gods, not like our job, right? And that's primarily because Rome is highly skeptical of new religions, because they really want to figure out, is this religious group for us or against us? So are they going to subvert the empire? So we kind of want to kick the tires a little bit and see whether or not we should be afraid of this, or whether really we can manage it, right? Can we kind of put this in the pantheon and we're all going to be fine? And so when you bring in foreign gods, it is a little bit skeptical, because there is this kind of subversive element of, we don't know how these gods are going to relate to the broader Roman empire here. And so Rowe has this great piece that this is kind of the setting of the scene where Paul then emerges to have this conversation. So it's not set up as if Paul's going there and just saying, hey, who can I evangelize today? But rather, as he's doing this, he's then is kind of put in this really interesting political situation where he is potentially, and as we'll see through the story, might be thrown in jail, right? He might actually be taken off the scene. I do think Luke gives us a little bit of a humorous line here in verse 21. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. It's this little slam that those Athenian philosophers, they just talk, right? They're always gabbing about the next idea. And you may have thought this too, like, can we get practical? So that's kind of Luke's slam here with this text. So anyways, Paul gets up to stand here at the Areopagus. I want to show us some pictures real quick, because that's always helpful. So this scene takes place at the Areopagus. This is obviously the Athens here. Athens at night. I do know the rooftop bar. I took that picture. And so on our trip, I'll try to make sure we end up there at some point, because it's a great view. You can actually get that view from a lot of rooftop bars. Anyways, what we see here is that Paul is on this Areopagus. Here we are. And it's this rocky outcrop. So this is where the scene takes place. And that's in the background, the big Athenian temple there. Which this, by the way, is not there today. I may have mentioned this last time I taught. This actually comes from the great city, Nashville, Tennessee, and their art museum in Nashville, which they rebuilt to within a 1-inch scale of the Parthenon, which is in Greece. So this would have been inside that building in Paul's day. So this is the scene. They're kind of taking him out to this rocky outcrop. They're going to ask him some questions, find out some more details, and figure out whether or not they're going to kind of kick this one up one more level.
So, Jason,
Yep.
just clarification. The Acropolis is where the Parthenon is, right?
Yep.
And the Acropolis is separate but near the Areopagus?
Yeah, it's, I'm trying to think, it's on like the southeast corner. So you can't walk from the Areopagus to the Acropolis. You have to go down and go back up, but you're looking over the kind of valley.
Okay.
That's separate.
And the Areopagus and Mars Hill are the same place, right?
Yeah, sometimes it's called Mars Hill. The Areopagus is where the councils met to kind of hear cases. And so again, Luke puts this scene right at the place like where they're outside the Acropolis, so this is where we kind of hear things. And as we'll see, right, nothing really eventually happens in this scene. It kind of ends with a little bit of a lackluster note. They kind of laugh and someone to hear more, which for Paul is good, right? It could have gone a very different way. And so yeah, it's set here as kind of like we're in this great backdrop of this text. All right, let me bring the text back up. And so as Paul begins, right, he starts off with this line, and this is Rowe's point as well, that the Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. And at first this kind of sounds like a compliment, But this verb in Greek can kind of go two different ways. This adjective. It can mean either religious or superstitious. And you can hear the English difference between that, right? And depending on who you're talking to, right? You know whether that's a compliment or not a compliment, right? So a lot of people might view religion as just superstition. You're just afraid of some stuff, and you're kind of, making your sign of the cross because you're just worried something bad's going to happen, right? But that's not really real, so you're just kind of being superstitious. Others also say, well, no, these are signs of piety. These are signs of deep commitment to our faith. These symbols, these signs matter. But you can see, depending on the audience, they're going to judge that differently, right? So Paul also has that little kind of double entendre there with his language. And the important part here is that the Athenians kind of hear what they want to hear, right? So the Athenians could hear this as a compliment, but as readers of Acts, as hearers up thus far in the story, we know that it's not a compliment, right? Because we already know that Paul is greatly distressed. And so we probably don't think Paul's going from, I'm really angry, to let's figure out how we can compliment them, right? It seems to make a little bit more sense of, I'm deeply frustrated, and you guys just haven't really got it yet, right? Like, this is just superstition at work. And this is what we would expect from a Second Temple Jewish person, right? From a monotheist, right? When monotheists look at polytheists, they go, I don't think so. Seems a little complex, right? Could we reduce this maybe to one, right? And so we get this extremely religious, superstitious language. Yeah.
So is that a well understood, understanding of this line?
Of the adjective, yes, you can translate it
So
either
why
way.
isn't that superstitious? Why don't they just say what they mean?
Yeah, we can check the translations. I mean, this is where all translations come down to interpretation, and a large majority of New Testament scholarship has seen this as a positive interaction. And then New Testament scholars do what New Testament scholars do, and say, what if it wasn't? No, they get kind of skeptical and say, I don't know if we should actually read the story that way. But oftentimes our translations lag behind kind of the more conclusions that sometimes New Testament scholars draw. And sometimes for good reason. Sometimes our ideas aren't good. And Rose is certainly a unique argument. I just find it a little bit more persuasive than the other one. I have other disagreements with Roe, but this is not one of them. So this language is that kind of people can hear what they want to hear. I might have mentioned this last time, and I know I mentioned this joke to Allie. When I was in North Carolina, I learned a phrase in the South. When I first got there, everyone would tell you, bless your heart, right? If you're not from the region, you might think, wow, so that's a great interaction. They're just so nice and kind here. But really it means you're a moron, right? But the person walking away is going to think, this is great. Everyone who knows the language goes, that wasn't a compliment, right? I'm not sure what the New England equivalent is, but we have that, everywhere. We have it in Britain. The British have ways of speaking about the Americans that we think, when a British person says that's interesting, they also don't mean it's a compliment. That took a while to learn being in academic circles. Everyone loves my work, right? And so anyways, this is kind of that ancient version of that. Every group, and it's probably good public speaking, right? You don't want to offend your audience. And so Paul kind of throws out this line. And again, he starts with this position of this inscription to the unknown God. And so he starts off this piece, which Roe mentions, he starts off with ignorance, right? So there's this thing that you don't know that I'm going to proclaim to you. And so we see here even Paul's kind of, the line of his argument is we're going to move not from, it's not like you're super close, you just need like a Jesus top-up, right? Like, it's actually the reverse. You're actually worshiping an unknown God, and the whole entire passage is actually going to call for repentance. Which again, for a Second Temple Jewish monotheist, this makes sense. When they meet Gentiles and non-monotheists, they go, guess what? It's time to drop the idols and turn around. And so Paul will say in 1 Thessalonians, I praise the Thessalonians because you turned from idols to serve the living God. And this is a very Jewish way of thinking about the world. And so Paul does this. He actually gives us a little bit of a riff on the Old Testament. He starts with creation. To the God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth does not live in shrines made by human hands. Again, this is just Genesis through Deuteronomy. Just read through the Pentateuch. our God created the world and everything in it, and guess what? We don't need to make idols of him, and he doesn't actually live physically in our temple. There's often a misconception about Israel's temple, is that God's, as Keelan, his presence resides there, but God does not physically reside there. Because again, remember in Jewish thought, you have this tension between God being everywhere, right, and then being localized. And so in Deuteronomy, it gets really nerdy, but the Deuteronomist goes out of his way to say that God places his name there, but not his actual, like, he's not embodied there, right? He's got his spirit, number one, right? And so they don't have any idols, but God says, my name will be rested here, i.e. I approve of this building, it's where you're going to come do all the things, it's official, right? And so this is a distinction for Jews, is that our God does not live in some place made by human hands. We don't need to craft an idol to represent him, because again, for Jews, right, Genesis 1 and 2, God's idols is us, right? Remember that word zelim in Hebrew can either mean image or idol. It's the same term. And so God has placed his image, his idol, in creation. He just placed it in humanity. And this is how humanity represents, right, the image of God. This is a pretty distinct claim that Israelites and then Jews are making in the first century, that God is not represented in an object. And part of we think this is that God doesn't want to be controlled, right? Idols are a way of controlling a deity. Like the vending machine, right? You can manipulate an idol. And so part of this, 10 commands, do not make any graven image, is number one, it's a little disrespectful, right? God of the universe, you can make me look like a cow, right? And then number two, like, I don't want you to control me. I'm not controllable. You follow me, and we're not going to have this kind of relationship. So Paul just has this kind of deeply Jewish critique of idols and says, that's just not what we do. We actually think it's better. And so this is kind of a critique there. And again, he moves on from one ancestor. He made all nations to inhabit the whole earth. He's not far from us, right? So God is immanent, right? So God is close to us. And then he quotes the Greek proem. For in him we live and move and have our being. We too are his offspring. So there is this connection that we do believe we have a relationship with the divine. The question is, how is that mediated? And obviously Jews are going to have a very distinct answer to that. And obviously what becomes Christianity emerges out of this thought, right? So Paul is speaking, just say it carefully, not like as a Christian per se, but as a Jewish Jesus follower in the first century. And saying this is where the movement is at. Again, he goes on and says, because, God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, which Roe has this really great line. Notice where the quote from Aratus is locked. It's in the time of human ignorance. And so Roe has this great point, like, again, it's not a compliment. It's even your great quote that he is not far from us, we too are his offspring. Paul categorizes underneath the domain of human ignorance, which is saying a lot to say to a Greek, right? I mean, they got Aristotle, Plato, like the philosophical traditions. There are no slouches, right, when it comes to intellect. And Paul says, from this point of view, it's ignorance, and now he commands all people everywhere to repent. So turn back, come back to the one true God, and serve him only, right? That's really the claim he's making. Again, the text moves on, that this person who God has appointed was raised from the dead, right? So here we got our kind of post-resurrection. And again, we're within within a decade, right, of this event, of Paul saying that Jesus is risen from the dead. And it's at this point, right, where it gets kind of silly for the philosophers. For lots of Greek philosophy, I'm going to summarize here, because of the influence of Plato and Platonism, physicality, the physical body, was not a good thing. And so this idea to be raised from the dead and get your body back is kind of going in the opposite direction. The goal of Greek philosophical thought primarily was to get rid of your body. It was the prison of the soul. And Plato believed that your soul would live on forever, disembodied. Transmigration of the soul to this kind of ethereal next place. And Paul says, no, this person was raised from the dead. He came back to life. His body came back. But for philosophers, again, some scoffed. So that's just ridiculous. Why would we want that? The whole goal is to not have that. And some said, we will hear this about you again. And notice, some joined them and became believers. And interestingly, we get a male and female mentioned, Dionysius and Damaris. So notice wherever Luke goes in Acts, we always get males and females paired. We're going to see this, you see this in Acts 16 with Lydia and the jailer. You're going to see this throughout the story. But notice women are joining the movement. This Areopagite, someone from this little region, is joining. And then the story ends, and that's all on around. But what we do find here in the story is that we get some of our first kind of like skeptical, Paul is kind of on the ropes a little bit. People have a question about his message, and that's going to build through the second half of Acts when we get to the trial scenes. Let me pause it there. Thoughts, questions on Acts 17? Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a background question. You mentioned that he left Thessaloniki because of opposition from Jews, and there's a reference to the synagogues here.
Yep.
How many Jews lived in the Greek cities then, and when and how did they get there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how did Greeks get to the synagogues or get to the Greek regions? A lot of this probably comes from exile. So back in 586 when Jews are scattered all over the ancient world, that's one way. Alexander the Great conquers a lot of these regions and enslaves a lot of people. And kind of carts them off or kills them. The Romans also do the same thing. And so you just have Jews spread all throughout the Roman world. And so even Roman authors will say every major city has a large population of Jews. And so what we learn from that, we call these diaspora Jews, Jews that live outside the land. And they seem to outnumber the Jews that live in the land in the first century. In fact, one of the most famous is Paul, right? Paul's from Tarsus. His parents are from Tarsus. And it just seems that a lot of Jews feel very comfortable living not in the land of ancient Israel. And so because of that, though, they then need a gathering spot. And so synagogue is just a house of prayer. It's more than that, actually. They're not just doing like services there. They're usually educational centers, recreational centers. They're a multifaceted thing. It's a communal kind of gathering spot. If memory serves me right, I think as long as you have 10 Jewish males in a city, you're supposed to have a synagogue. Now it gets interesting because in Acts 16, when Paul's in Philippi, he says we went to the river to look for a house of prayer. And so there's a debate, did Philippi have a synagogue or not? And so it maybe there's not a lot of Jewish presence there, but certainly in Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, Egypt, Corinth, Thessalonica, large populations of Jews living there. Yeah.
You mentioned this double-edged insult compliment thing, but I often have thought of and heard the Mars Hill talk as being Paul acknowledging that there's some nascent receptivity in that culture for the gospel, and he's just opening it up. Right. By not necessarily complimenting or insulting them, but kind of acknowledging something by quoting their poets.
Yep.
I just think that's the Mars Hill strategy, if there is one, for evangelization, seems to be respect for the other culture and their point of view.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of merit to that, and certainly today I think we need to begin there, right? As we think about talking about Jesus in the public square, I would just argue that our world looks a little bit differently, and that is actually, if we were, know groups that are much more antagonistic, that just doesn't work in our world and our culture. So that's not a good strategy. I think in Paul's world, which just tends to be a little bit more antagonistic among all things, there's a little bit more, I hate to say the word confrontation, but that's just kind of the kind of ancient Mediterranean, we're going to argue about something. I'm not sure and that's the work that we have to do today to say, okay, how do we translate that? What is the best strategy? And so I don't think, yelling at people is probably the best way to do it, or insulting them. That's going to push more people off. Here, obviously, it engages people. They come into that. And so I think part of that is seeing that our culture is different than that one. I think there is a widespread recognition, and he starts there. This is the God who created all humans, right? So all humanity in some ways is tied to this creator God. And that's certainly, I think, a positive element. I think for Paul, the trip up, though, is the call to repentance in the times of ignorance. That today, we would say, how do we say, how do we tell someone that, you're kind of ignorant, right? That's kind of rough. And so I don't think Paul pulls back from that, because he's saying, I want to call you from polytheism to the worship of the one true God. And so I think he does that through a first century mechanism that may or may not work today for us. And so I think it's worth thinking through that. But I think there's points of it. He's not completely pushing them aside. The one sign of respect is that he's engaging, right? There's one way he could say, I'm just not going to talk to you. Like, I'm not talking to pagans, right? But that doesn't seem to be his approach. He seems to want to go in and have a conversation, which I think in some level is an ultimate form of respect, is the ability to engage with someone who is, in terms of Paul, completely different than him.
And apparently they'd like to argue it.
They did, yes. Yeah, so I think Paul knows his audience. Yeah.
This is a church history question,
Yeah.
more than a New Testament question, but now read someone like Justin Martyr or Origen. I mean, they appropriate Greek philosophy far more than Paul did, and it seems like Christian belief became more acceptable to the Hellenistic world. So, just wondering what changed between Paul to even like someone like Justin Martyr.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So,
Can you repeat the question?
yes.
Oh, sorry. So, Justin Martyr and Origen, they were heavily trained and versed in Greek philosophy, and so they appropriated Greek thought into Christian belief in a way that seems like it's very became more acceptable to people, say, living in Athens or more the intellectual class of the ancient world. So I was just wondering what changed between Paul and someone like Justin Martyr.
Could you kind of repeat that?
Yeah, let me repeat it for everyone through the mic. So yeah, the question is, right after we get out of this scene, in the next couple centuries, 2nd and 3rd century, the church fathers and mothers are going to use Greek philosophy and incorporate it into theological reflection in a way that seems much more amenable than maybe what Paul does here. And so the question is, how does that process unfold? I think one of the first pieces, and this scene actually becomes key for that. So again, texts always have what we call afterlives. There's a whole reception history for how texts are received by different people after they're written down, right? Because we have to interpret them. And so what becomes really interesting is as this movement grows, it becomes predominantly Gentile. And when we say Gentile, we're already kind of mixing the terms a little bit. These are non-Jewish people, and particularly Greek people. And a lot of the Jewish fathers, church fathers and mothers are actually scholastically trained in Greek and Roman thought and philosophy and rhetoric. And so what they essentially do, particularly someone like Origen, is they take all the skills that they learn on how to interpret Aristotle and Plato and then in the texts and go, let's go interpret Moses. Let's go interpret the Gospels. That makes sense. They're saying we're just going to use our skills in philosophy and rhetoric to interpret a new text, and they put out fascinating, really great stuff. The other piece is that there is this cultural component, and Acts 17 kind of becomes a set piece for saying, how do we engage philosophically within a world that is dominated by Greek philosophy? How do we stand on our own 2 feet and kind of make this argument in the public square, to use a kind of modern point? And so what they do is they actually utilize Greek philosophy to talk about monotheism, to talk about divine simplicity, that God is one. And it really helps them, evangelistically, to use that kind of modern term, to relate to other Greeks, particularly philosophers, who are saying, we just think this stuff just doesn't make sense. And I think what's hard for us is that we don't think polytheistically. We assume monotheism, or even atheism. And that's not the world of the 2nd and 3rd century. You have to make a case, philosophically speaking, for why you should worship one God. That is not clear, that is not coherent. In fact, it seems dangerous and kind of stupid. Because if you're wrong, as we mentioned at one adult formation, if you're not worshiping the gods, their wrath is going to come upon you. And so there's this, and cities are interested in this, empires are interested in this. And so the Greek fathers actually kind of go toe-to-toe with philosophy and say, we think we can actually make an argument and say that this is actually, it's a solid belief system. It's not just like superstition, to put it in Acts 17 language. Yeah.
So, hearing what you said earlier about the Jewish diaspora,
Yep.
is it reasonable to conclude that most of the people in the audience were Greek polytheists? And if so, why would the argument, the deeply Jewish arguments, resonate with them, other than the tie-in to the 2 Greek poets?
Right.
I mean, it would seem a foreign argument that he's using to justify himself as not saying something that is worthy of his being thrown into jail.
Yeah, so I think one thing, so there's a couple, we call it narrative worlds. So the first reader of Acts is Theophilus, right? Theophilus and his reading group of friends. And so this scene is doing something for him and saying, okay, Paul stood before philosophers and you know what? He made it through the gauntlet, right? So he made it standing. I also think there's another world in which if Luke is recording history at some level here, this is going to be a common experience for Jesus followers going forward, right? And I think you see this more clearly, we'll see this in a minute, with some of the trial scenes. It's really important that Paul appears before a Roman official and is considered that he's not guilty of subverting the Roman Empire. That's what the claim is. And you want to think about Luke almost as like a lawyer. He's providing evidence, potentially for future cases. And so what Acts is doing at one level is it's demonstrating a lot of the experiences that Jesus followers are going to have in the late first century, early second and third century, is that they're going to be called before magistrates, they're going to be called before philosophers. And so these stories in some ways are saying, hey, this happened to one of our leading figures. You're not alone. And so I think for Theophilus and his friends, it's saying this faith has been like tested, right? It's not this thing that you're believing in. So remember Acts 1:1-4, that you might have confidence in what you believed. Some of these stories are doing that work of saying, as Jesus followers are living in these cities and maybe getting called into court themselves, they can point to cases and say, well, actually, Paul was on trial for that, and he was fine. Maybe they're talking about Jesus in the Agora, and someone says, are you bringing in foreign divinities? They can rely on Acts 17 and say, hey, even the Athenians didn't get bent out of shape, right? Like, Paul made it out kind of scot-free. And so I think these stories have multiple things that Luke's doing with them, not just for Theophilus, not just for theology, but for some really practical issues in the first century. That it almost sets precedent in that way. And this is something that, to be honest, Jews have been doing for their entire identity. So you have Philo down in Alexandria, Egypt, and he's syncing up Greek philosophy with the Pentateuch. And he's putting Moses forward as the greatest philosopher that ever lived. So him and Josephus do a runaround on the Greeks. They think your poets are great. We got Moses. We got a law. We got texts. And guess what? They predate your texts. And so, in fact, Josephus goes as far to say the Greeks stole their ideas from Moses. And so it just becomes, Jews are having to form an identity as a minority group in the ancient world and to defend themselves. And this is that word we're going to see that even today we use, but differently, the word apologetics. The word apologia means to give a defense. Now we see that as debate in our world because we have apologetic centers and apologists, right? In the ancient world, it just means to give kind of a formal rationale for what you're doing. Now sometimes that can be negative, i.e. you're on trial, so defend yourself. But it can mean, are your beliefs defensible? Do they have merit and worth believing? And again, just to be clear, these are reasons that make sense in the first century. Just to kind of put that caveat. They may not make sense today, right? Because our worlds have shifted. And so we're not dealing as much, see this very carefully, with polytheism, right? Now, depending on where you're at in the world, that may be a bigger concern for you, right? But here today, at least in my 40 years of experience, I haven't met many polytheists, right? We meet the opposite. We meet atheists, right? People who don't believe in any gods. And so we just have a very different world that we're living in post the Enlightenment that Paul and the Jesus followers were not encountering. They didn't have to convince people of the divine. They didn't have to convince people of God's interaction in the world. They didn't have to convince people that you can have a quasi, divine human being. Like that's just, welcome to the party, right? The harder part is saying that there's only one, right? And this is why Jews and the early Christians begin to get the label atheists in the first century. Because atheism originally just means to be against the gods, right? So theism means God. The alpha primitive in Greek negates that. And so the Christians and the Jews were atheists because they didn't believe in enough gods. So they were against the gods because they had monotheism. And so you can see kind of that link there.
But the last three verses of 17, there are three responses that are named.
Yep.
And are those three responses coming out of a pool of predominantly polytheistic Athenians
In the Acts 17 encounter?
right there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So this would be primarily they're all Greek speaking polytheists.
All of them, despite the
Yep.
diaspora.
Despite, yeah, I don't think we have a lot of Jews. I don't think we get any Jews in this scene, unlike in Thessalonica. So this is again Paul in an entirely Greek world. And again, this might be some of the responses that Theophilus and his friends have heard, right? Or people reading this text later on saying, "Yeah, we talked about Jesus, and you know what? Some people laughed at us. Some people, were convinced, and some people were skeptical." Like, so I mean, I think it's like putting color to the experience that the early Jesus followers themselves are having, right? So it's kind of rooting that in that environment. Great. Acts 17 is a great text. There's lots to say there. We gotta move on a little bit. Paul goes to Corinth. He meets Priscilla and Aquila again, male and female, happen to be married. Corinth becomes a really interesting place for Paul. He's going to spend a lot of time there, 18 months, and he's going to write up to 4 letters to that community. And so we only have 2 of them. But he's in high contact with this community, and Corinth becomes a big base of operations for Paul. Paul, we think, writes Romans from Corinth. This is where he sends Phoebe in Romans 16:1. She's from Kenkrea, which is on the eastern side of Corinth here. We're going to be there in about a week. Standing on the eastern side. She would have set off from the western side, of course, but Phoebe's from here, the eastern side of the port town. And she set off from here with Romans to take it over to Italy. So Corinth becomes very, very central for Paul. And I always have to say this fact because my friend DJ reminded me of it, and it's worth repeating. Paul knows about 10 Christian men in Corinth. So if you read Acts 18 and the Corinthian letters, you can name about 10 individual men in the community. He also names a lot of women. And so it just becomes even more interesting that Paul sends Romans with Phoebe. Like, he had other men he could have sent it with. And yet he sends Phoebe. Remember, we think that Phoebe's the first one to read aloud the letter to the Romans and interpret it. So again, as Beverly Gaventa says, the first time Romans was ever heard, it was heard in a feminine voice. And that seems a very particular choice that Paul makes, because he knows Aquila, he knows Apollos is in Corinth, he knows a bunch of other dudes are in Corinth, and yet this is the choice he makes when he wants Romans sent. Just going to throw that out there, just worth thinking about. So we have to look at text, but we also look at Paul's actions, right? We want to see his kind of thoughts sometimes. All right, so he's in Athens. I got to skip forward from here because we don't have enough time. We need 4 more weeks of adult formation. Corinth is a great place. We're going to read 1 Corinthians 13 there. That's really fun. Sorry, we got to skip this. Acts 19, Paul gets in hot water again. This time he's in Ephesus. And again, we get temples. So notice the theme of Acts. Paul goes to Gentile cities. He gets in trouble with non-Jewish people for proclaiming Jesus of Nazareth, right? And this is the temple of Artemis. The primary people we meet are these silversmiths. So their job is making little shrines for the god Artemis that people could buy and then worship either in their home or in their pocket, because sometimes they're small. You always need a little pocket deity, right? Just take it with you. And so this is kind of the chief deity of Ephesus. Paul's friends are dragged into the theater. The theater seats about 25,000 people. It's pretty big. It says for about 3 hours they shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And they're about to kind of tear Paul's friends limb from limb, because they see, again, this line here in Acts 8:19, and this riot, that the entire infrastructure, both economic, social, and political, is under threat from this message. So the primary residents of Ephesus are worried that they're going to upset the gods. Because what we learn in the story is that Paul is successful in Ephesus, and he's drawing people out of pagan temples. Because that's what we learn in 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians. A big problem for Paul is keeping Gentiles out of pagan temples. He seems to be successful in Ephesus, and people start to notice because the stock starts to dip on the Ephesian silversmiths. Right? I'm joking, they don't have a stock market. But no one's buying their wares anymore, and they're starting to notice that the economic bottom line is starting to drop out here. And that has big ramifications for the Ephesian economy, because it seems like if the gods aren't being worshipped, well, then the economy is going to crash, i.e. our civilization is going to go down the drain, because Artemis is going to lash out and send judgment right on the town. And so they get these figures in. They want to kind of rile them up and tell them to stop. Right. So this is the first form of what we might call social control. They try to put some literally the fear of God into them. Right. Stop what you're doing, or else. Right. And here we see that this again would be a typical response that maybe some other Jesus followers have had. And again, what we find is that they are let go. There's nothing that's going to happen here, and we find out from even the resident political figure of Ephesus that they're in danger of being charged with rioting, since there's no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. When he said this, he dismissed the assembly. And so here's this scene. It comes right off the heels of the riot in Corinth, which we had Gallio, a Roman proconsul, weigh in on. And they said, these early Jesus followers are not a threat to the Roman Empire. This seems a matter of local Jewish problems. It doesn't concern us. Paul's free to go. And so this gets referenced here in Ephesus. And so what I want you to see is that what's happened in Corinth, that message has made its way to Ephesus. So that even the city clerk here, verse 35, is saying, wait a second, I've heard about what happened to the Christians, the Jesus followers in Corinth. That didn't go well for us when we tried to get them up on these kind of hopped up charges. We don't want that to happen here. And so he dismisses the crowd. And so you're already seeing this kind of the ramifications of these kind of cases in these hearings. They're being dismissed. And that's the big point for Luke. They're heard, they're tried, they're dismissed. And that seems to be going well until it now shifts. So they kind of clear away the charge by at least 16 to 18 that Paul is subverting Roman law. But now the question is going to shift in the second half of the book. What about Jewish law? What about fellow Jews? And here we get one of the primary charges in Acts. I mentioned to you, we don't really read these chapters in Acts 20, 1 and following. But here's the report. It comes from James. Paul is now in Jerusalem with James. It says, James and the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. So Paul gives them a rehash of Acts 16 through 20. When they heard it, they praised God. They said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews, and they are all zealous for the law. They have been told about you, that you teach all the Jews among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, and that you tell them not to circumcise their children or observe customs. What then is to be done? This is the report. So notice the report now is that other Jewish groups are worried about you. Here's the report. I'm just going to pass it along to you. That you're out there telling Jews that they can't circumcise their kids and to stop following the law of Moses. And this appears to be in the first century a really important deal. And again, we've talked about this a long time, but in an entirely Jewish movement, this is a big deal. Is Paul part of the movement, or is he an apostate? Is he a renegade? It might not be as a pressing concern for us, but it is in the first century when the movement is almost entirely Jewish. I think Luke responds to this, and this is part of what I'm going to drop in my conference paper in July here, is that I think this charge is actually one of the most important in the book of Acts, because it's at the case of, is Paul part of the movement or not? Is what he is doing legitimate or not legitimate? And Luke's going to answer it in two ways. So notice the charges. There's two. And I just want to make one thing clear. This term believers that James says is the term that Luke uses for Jesus followers throughout the book of Acts. It's unanimous. Every time he says the word believers, it's someone who believes in Jesus. And notice, there's thousands of them, and they're all zealous for the law. Now again, this should make sense. As an entirely Jewish movement, they've been living with Judaism their entire lives. They really like it, because again, there's nothing inherently wrong with the law. But the question becomes, these Gentiles are not following the law, so what are Jews to do? And here's the claim, two charges. You've been telling the Jews among the Gentiles to forsake Moses in two ways. So one charge, two claims. How are you telling them to forsake the law of Moses? To not circumcise their children and to not observe the customs. So does that make sense? There's like 1A and 1B here. One big charge, two pieces of evidence, right? I'm going to be a quasi-lawyer here for a minute. Don't tell John or any other lawyers. So that's the thing. So Luke answers the first one immediately in chapter 21. So in chapter 21, notice what happens. What is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Join these men, go through the rite of purification with them, and pay for the shaving of their heads. Why? Thus all will know that there's nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself observe and guard, the word there is keep, the law. So notice the claim. To refute the claim, perform the law. Keep it. But as for the Gentiles who become believers, we have sent a letter to them with our judgment, and we get that text from Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council. Verse 26, then Paul took the men, and the next day, having purified himself, he entered the temple with them, making public the completion of the days of the purification when the sacrifice would be made for each of them. So notice what Acts 21 does. It resolves the rumor that Paul is telling people to forsake the customs. Because what does Paul do? He performs a custom, right? And so Luke is saying, look, Paul is actually keeping this. He appears to be happy to do so, right? There's no qualms there. But what about the other one? You remember what the other claim was? You're telling people not to circumcise their children. That one's not answered here, but it has been answered in the book of Acts. To find out that answer, you got to go back in time a little bit to Acts 16. This is right after the Jerusalem Council. Remember, the Jerusalem Council, they decide Gentiles do not need to be circumcised. That's the big thing, right? Which makes it really weird when we get to Acts 16:1. Paul went to Derbe and to Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by believers in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and had him circumcised on account of, or because of, you can translate it however you want, the Jews who were there in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So notice in Acts 16, we didn't know this charge was coming, right? We didn't know that Paul was going to be on trial if you're reading the book for the first time. But remember, one of the claims is that Paul is telling Jewish parents not to circumcise their babies, their male babies, on the 8th day. And now this text in Acts 16 kind of looms large, because what do we have Paul doing but circumcising a male himself? And what's interesting is that this case, and it's really interesting in the commentaries to see how scholars treat this, F.F. Bruce called it a minor surgical procedure. And I'm going to say in my conference paper, Timothy was unavailable for comment. I'm hoping to get that reaction. Right? Like, he's an adult male, and Paul's like, Timothy, I got some good news and bad news. You're going on the trip. The cost of admission? No. Right? So he circumcises an adult male, which I think for Luke, and this is the argument of my paper, is that if Paul is willing to do this in adult cases with what we might call ambiguous males of ambiguous ethnic descent, right? Because he has a Jewish mom and a Greek dad. Like, what one takes over there? How much more so if both parents are Jewish and it's a baby, right? And so I argued that in this paper that I think Acts 16 is Luke's response to that other charge. Paul doesn't tell Jewish parents not to circumcise their babies. In fact, he's out there circumcising adult males right after the Jerusalem Council because his mom's Jewish. And in my paper, I'm making the argument that if any part of you is Jewish in the first century, guess what? You're getting circumcised. That the law against circumcision is only for 100% Gentile flesh. And that even in these ambiguous cases, Paul falls on the pro-circumcision side. Which again is not a way we're typically accustomed to reading Paul. We see him as the anti-circumcision guy because of like Galatians. But again, Galatians is written to entirely Gentiles. He's not talking to Jews there. And this becomes a piece, again, in that first century context, that becomes really, really important for Paul. All right, the final thing, and I want to leave some room for some questions. That's the controversial part. We'll see if my colleagues agree. They might not. Paul sees the trial not going well in Jerusalem. He gets put on trial for this. He plays his Roman citizenship and gets a one-way paid trip to Rome on a Roman ship to have his case tried before Caesar. We actually don't get that trial. What we get is Paul under house arrest in Rome. And this really completes for Luke that kind of journey from Acts 1:8, that you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the earth. We've landed there in Rome, although Rome probably doesn't consider themselves the uttermost parts of the earth, right? So a little slam there. But there he is in Rome, and he's awaiting trial. And Luke gives us a little clue of what's going to happen. He says that he was teaching about the kingdom of God and the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. That last line, without hindrance, is a legal term in the Roman world, which seems to indicate that Luke thinks that Paul's going to get off. We're not entirely sure why Luke ends his story here, because this is probably happening in the 60s CE, and Luke writes in like the 90s. So he probably has 30 more years of potential material, but it seems an explicit choice that he makes to end the story here. And the reason why we think that is that he doesn't want the Paul story to overshadow the Jesus story. Remember, Jesus is resurrected. If Paul does get beheaded, like church history tells us, he's not resurrected. And so then you got a resurrection story and a non-resurrection story. And number two, Luke does not seem to be interested again in the major characters. I said this back all at the beginning. At best, all the humans that we meet in the book of Acts are supporting cast. The primary topic is the kingdom of God. And we saw this with Peter, right? After Acts 15, we don't know what happens to Peter. Interestingly enough, after Acts 28, we don't know what happens to Paul either. But what that allows us to do as scholars say, it doesn't look like Luke is interested in telling us what happens to Peter and Paul. He does it for two of the major characters. We don't know what happens to them. What he is interested in is being witnesses of the kingdom of God and proclaiming Jesus. And for Luke's readers, right, this is their role. They're hearing the story. They're hearing the reports of what Jesus had done. And it's their goal to do what? Proclaim the kingdom of God and teach about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. And so in some ways, the ending of Acts, although maybe lackluster for us, actually serves to incorporate us as an audience. To say, okay, Paul's doing this, what about you? So we'll end it there. I know we have a couple minutes. Thoughts, questions on the ending of Acts, trials, scenes?
Just one thing. Back to the question of the insult and compliment thing, the different culture. This thing of the circumcision is like a mirror of that, it seems to me. He's addressing Jewish identity, not Greek identity.
Exactly.
And then the whole thing of sending a woman, Phoebe, and not some of these well-known exemplars, male exemplars, and other instances of him challenging all these identity categories.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, he seems to make some pretty choices that were, how we've encountered Paul, they may not be the Paul that we've encountered. He seems to be doing something, I would argue, differently than sometimes his stereotypes that he gets. Yeah, and with the Jewish groups, right, yeah, he has, he's willing to circumcise Timothy, kind of go out of his way to accommodate, right, that. And does it offend them? Does it seem to insult them? Yeah, very different. I think it's probably Paul realizing he's in the minority, right, so he's not kind of leading the scene there.
Why the head shaving?
That seems to be a Nazarite vow, so a vow of commitment to the Lord. So you see this in Judges with Samson. Sorry, not that one. It isn't Judges, but not with Samson. But a Nazarite vow is just a sign of like commitment, like fasting. It's a special dedication that you would do. And clearly they're practicing it in the first century, and Paul participates in it. So again, I think when we think Paul anti-law, some of us think we need to be more strategic with that language, because it doesn't appear that Paul has a problem performing the law. Now, some will say Luke gets Paul wrong. I think Luke gets Paul right. And I think what Paul has to say negatively about the law is Gentiles' relationship to it, not necessarily Jews. In the first century. Yep.
So I'm curious about, so I heard that a number of scholars state that Acts was written around 80, 90. Is that connected? I heard it's connected with Josephus. Do you hold that view? Or do you have other reasons for that?
Yeah, the dating of Acts ranges, I would say most people, or most scholars I interact with probably date to the early 2nd century. So some people put it as late as like 110, 120. The reason for that is they want, I would argue, they want Luke to be disconnected from some of the history. So again, Paul appears very Jewish. He obviously got that wrong because he's living so far away. I'd say a good majority of scholarships probably puts it in the 80, 90 region. And some of that is related to the Gallio piece that's in Acts 16. That actually helps us date the book and almost date all of New Testament chronology, because Paul gives us the name of a Roman official in Corinth. And we know from Roman records he was only there for about 6 months because he gets sick and he has to go down to Egypt. And so it actually gives us, Fitzmyer says, the one chronological peg to hang all of New Testament chronology on. So when we say that Romans was written here, 1 Thessalonians is here, we're dating it from Acts 16. It's the point that we scope out from, because we know it's a 6-month window in this period, so we can kind of extrapolate from there. Because the letters themselves don't have like a time and date stamp, right? It's not like our documents today that we go created on, right? I wish we had that. And so we have to use that date. And so that becomes the reason why we think, if it's true that that's the dating, it goes from the 60s there. Yep. Great questions. Thoughts? Anyone else?
Is today Pentecost something?
No, one more week, 24th. Yep.
How does Paul compete with all these Greek gods? Like at several places in the Acts says that he does miracles, heals people, and so that's how the Christianity is developed. Or
That's a great point. So one piece we haven't highlighted, just in terms of kind of themes of Acts, is that one of the most persuasive arguments for Gentiles is miracles, signs and wonders. And so that's what all these stories are doing in Acts for a Greek audience, is saying that there's, again, it's not the term miracle in ancient world, that's a modern term. It's called a deed of power. And so these are very powerful figures, and so they must be onto something. And then what we get, this other line, is that they're very persuasive. So they use rhetoric to convince people, and not convince in a negative way, but to persuade that this is actually true, as the early Christian tradition would say, true, good, and beautiful. And so there's this attractional element. Obviously, we have social care for people. That's one element that draws people in. Deeds of power, the miracles, and then the persuasive teaching. Those three things seem to be this kind of really unique combination of elements in the first century that draws Gentiles in to that through a work of the Spirit. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's been fun. Thanks for a great adult formation. I guess we'll be back in the fall. I'm sure there's one more, but until then.